The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you on the West Coast. My name is Richard Garrett. I am the North America Director for iGraduate. Very pleased you could join us for this introduction to the International Student Barometer, the world's largest survey of international student satisfaction. This is one of a series of webinars we've been doing in the United States in recent months, designed to raise awareness of this tool, the kinds of institutions that are using it around the world, including here in the US, and the value and benefits of participation. What I'm going to do is go through the following that you can see on the slide here. I'm going to give you an introduction to the ISB, its origins, its coverage, how it works, then stand back and consider US context when it comes to international students, and then some summative remarks about the value of the ISB, the International Student Barometer, given that context. I then want to turn to our two panelists from peer institutions, two institutions that have been using the ISB for a period of time, Johnson & Wales University in Rhode Island and University of Milwaukee in Wisconsin, a private and a public university respectively. And I'll introduce our panelists from those institutions a bit later on. After that conversation, where I'm going to be asking our panelists their rationale for getting involved with the ISB, how it's worked on the ground for them, insights they've benefited from so far, and plans for the future. And then we'll turn to what I've labeled insights from the ISB, the International Student Barometer, in terms of big data. As you'll see, the ISB is, as I said, the world's largest survey of international student satisfaction, and to my mind, fills something of a gap in this field. International higher education in the US is very well served in terms of professional associations, specialist journals, anecdotal on-the-ground experience, but perhaps would also benefit from quantitative data, cross-institutional data, cross-country data even, embodied in the ISB. So I'm going to give you some examples of the kinds of patterns we can see from looking at this scaled quantitative data, and I'll also point you to a new report that we've just put out that we'd be happy to send you if you're interested. And then we'll close out with some final Q&A. Now, if anyone in the audience has a question, feel free to use the chat functionality on the dashboard at the right of your screen. If you have quick questions as we go through, my colleagues will respond to that in the moment. If it's a question from me or one of the panelists to do with the content, then we will get to that in the last 15 minutes or so. So let's start with the basics of the ISB. How does it work, and so forth. The ISB is the first and remains the flagship product of iGraduate, the International Graduate Insight Group, which is a UK company founded about 10 years ago, originally independent and now part of Tribal Group, which is a much larger UK-based education services firm across K-12, higher education, and vocational education. The logic of the ISB under iGraduate is that rather than each individual university or college conducting only their own survey of international student satisfaction or experience or engagement, valuable though those surveys are, there's clearly benefit in cross-institutional perspective, understanding whether the results you're getting for your international students are very typical, given the size and shape of your institution, or are exceptional in a positive sense, or actually below average, and why that might be. So the origin of the ISB is that recognition of the benefit of cross-institutional and ultimately cross-country perspectives on what is, by definition, a very international phenomenon characterized by ever more institutional interest and ever more student choice. Now you can see from this graphic that the company is steadily applying that logic to other constituents, such as surveying prospective students or domestic students, or surveying alumni. Now we're not going to talk about any of those, but just so you understand that background. And as you can see in terms of the scale that I've been emphasizing, within 10 years, iGraduate has worked in terms of post-secondary education with well over 1,000 institutions, universities, colleges, English language schools, vocational institutions of one kind or another, pathway firms and providers across 28 different countries with strong concentrations in the major English-speaking markets, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and increasingly North America as well. And we have a total data set of well over 1.5 million respondents. But today we're going to focus on the International Student Barometer. Just a quick sense of coverage and logistics. The core questionnaire covers the arrival experience for new international students, the learning experience in and around the classroom, the living experience beyond the classroom, and then support services, both those dedicated to international students like the International Student Office, whatever it's called on campus, and services more generally. We also ask whether the international student would recommend the institution to a compatriot. We ask about the selection process and the application process, including whether the student used an education agent and what they thought of that service. And we also ask some experiential engagement questions as well. The questionnaire is obviously semi-standardized to permit comparability across institutions and across countries, but we do customize by country, by terminology particular to that country, and then each institution can similarly change the name of things, use particular terminology, add a few questions, change a few questions. The survey covers all international students with undergraduate and graduate at the core right through to PhD, and it can also encompass pathway students if that's relevant, and also intensive English students. And it covers all years of study. Students are invited to give feedback in a window of their choosing between October and December of each year. So we are coming up to the 2014 fall window when participating schools administer the survey. Just to give you a sense of scale within higher education, so degree granting institutions that we work with, last fall survey, fall 2013, we got just under 145,000 unique responses from international students from about 180 universities and colleges across 13 countries. So of its kind, by far the largest survey in the world. Institutions then benefit from their own results broken down internally between nationalities, between academic departments and schools and colleges, between particular service units and various other variables. But then there's also the option of a peer group benchmark. If an institution wants to compare itself to particular institutions at home or a mix of home and international institutions, then we can do that. And then as standard, there's always a national benchmark and an international benchmark, both for some of the macro variables or macro metrics like overall satisfaction or propensity to recommend the institution, and then on the various sub-metrics that I'll show you in a moment. And then each institution gets an in-person report back session that can be a mix of a large group presentation, perhaps inviting representatives from academic departments, service units, administrative functions, and then it can also involve a small group discussion with, say, the International Office or leaders of various bits of the institution to dive into more detail and get a clearer sense of possible next steps. And obviously the data is all confidential to the institution, and the presentation itself can be customized based on what each institution might like. So let me just give you a quick overview of the four main sections of the survey and give you a sense of the kind of sub-items that we ask institutions to students to comment on. So under the learning section, so the international student experience in and around the classroom, we ask about, and this is just shorthand, but we ask about everything from different pedagogical experiences they might be going through, the research environment, if that's appropriate, assessment, culture, library and other facilities, the extent to which employability is specifically tackled in the classroom, the availability of work experience, that can be particularly challenging in the US around international students, English language issues, some research-specific issues around topic selection, if that's relevant for that student. In terms of living, we cover everything from housing and accommodation, safety, integration with other students, both domestic and international, various kinds of social facilities and activities, technology, faith provision, transportation, and some financial matters. Under support services, these are the generic categories called by the generic names. Each institution will customize them based on what they offer and what they call them. But everything from the International Student Office, IT support, graduate school, health center, career services, and so forth. Then the arrival section, and we only ask these questions of recently arrived international students, either in the fall or the few months prior. Some of these questions overlap some of the other areas, but some are particular. So, for example, we ask about the welcome or pickup experience and point of arrival, the airport, the train station, whatever it might be. That can often be a point of particular concern for international students. We ask about the orientation and registration process, initial access to technology, initial financial matters, housing matters, integration matters. All of these are items on the survey where we invite international students to, on a consistent scale, offer their views on their satisfaction at their point in time in terms of their stay in the US in this case. This slide just gives you an overview of the kinds of data you get. It's just an indicative summary. It's not meant to be read in and of itself, but let me just walk you through some pieces of it. So beyond the in-person presentation you would get as a participating institution, you also get access to supporting data. We can only cover so much in a single presentation. There's obviously a lot of potential for cross-tabulation, disaggregation of the sample, looking at particular nationalities or departments or service units. That's done both through supporting Excel files with built-in pivot table functionality, but also through our data visualization software Interact, which every client gets a login to, and then in a very user-friendly way you can change the comparison group, the benchmark group, whatever it is you want to look at. If you've been working with us for more than 1 year, you can look at changes in the data over time. And you can also map some of that data geographically, and the survey also invites international students to offer verbatim comments rather than just indicate satisfaction on a standard scale, to give a bit more color as to why they're relatively happy or not happy in each case. This slide just gives you a sense of our current clients in the United States. As you can see, it's a nice mix of public and private. A lot of flagship institutions, research-intensive institutions, but also what we might call more regional institutions or institutions that historically may have enrolled few international students, but for various reasons are very much active in this market. But the point being that any certainly four-year institution, and we're also beginning to work with two-year institutions as well. So, for example, you can see Valencia Community College down there on the left. We're beginning to build up a genuine peer group across a variety of institutional types as the survey gains more visibility and participation here in the US. So let me just now comment on the US context, particularly with respect to the broader range of institutions that are seeking a role in terms of international student recruitment above and beyond what may have been the norm in the past. This slide, just to set the scene, just gives you a sense of how much of an outlier the US is in a couple of different respects. So in terms of absolute number of international students, everybody knows that the US enrolls far more than any other country. This is data from 2011, simply because it allows us to look at all these different countries at once. We obviously have more recent data for the US and some of the other countries, but not all of them. So this is drawing on OECD, UNESCO, and other sources. So 2011, just over 700,000 international students in US higher education, far higher than any other country. But the other axis points to the proportion of all students by country that are international. And there the US is an outlier in the other sense. The US has still fewer than 5% of its students hailing from another country, compared to double that, 10%, in the likes of Canada, France, Germany, and then 4 times that when it comes to the UK and Australia, and even higher when it comes to New Zealand. So the US is in a very interesting position. It has arguably the best brand when it comes to higher education in the world. It's known to recruit a lot of international students, but in terms of intensity of enrollment, in terms of potential capacity to enroll international students, the US arguably hasn't really tested itself. But as we'll see on the next couple of slides, that's very much begun to change over the last couple of years. Just to give you an initial sense of that, as you know, just from looking at IIE data in recent years, in the US, total international students, meaning here undergrads and grads, have grown 45% since 2005-06 up to 2012. Very, very rapid growth. But what I want to emphasize on the next couple of slides is the unevenness of that growth and the implications of that for institutions that are trying to break into this market in a more scaled way. So let me just break down this growth, just comparing 2008 and 2012. 2008, the beginnings of the Great Recession, that was often the financial stimulus for many US universities and colleges to take the international market more seriously. So that contrast between 08 and 12 is quite important. So just breaking the numbers down into a few categories, looking at the Carnegie classification of institutions between the very high research-centric schools on the left through the 3 types of master's institutions, picking out the main baccalaureate category, the liberal arts schools essentially, and then looking at standalone art and design schools for reasons that you'll see in a moment, and then finally community colleges. If we look at the number of international undergrads in fall 2008, you can see 3 groups really dominate. The research-intensive institutions, particularly the very high Carnegie classification, 15 on the far left, the larger master's institutions, and then community colleges. If we then fast forward to 2012, and these are the actual numbers for that year, you can see some interesting changes. Very rapid growth among the very high research activity schools and then the high research schools. More modest growth among other doctoral and the 3 master's categories. A little bit higher, as you'll see, for baccalaureate. And then, again, growth for art and design, and community colleges actually falling in absolute numbers. And if we pull up those growth rates specifically, you can see some very interesting differences. So amongst the most research-intensive institutions, 72% growth when it comes to undergraduate international enrollment in just those 4 years. And then as the research intensity declines by category, similarly the growth declines. Among the master's schools, certainly respectable growth, around 20% in each case, but far below what's achieved by the very research-intensive institutions. The liberal arts schools grew a bit faster, but not as fast as the doctoral institutions. The standalone art and design schools, which have always been very internationally focused, have continued to increase that international intensity. And then community colleges, despite still enrolling the second largest now number of international undergrads, actually lost ground over that period. So a very interesting mix of performance from dramatic growth to net decline, and then a lot of positions in between. Now, if we look at that data in another way, so those same categories of institution, and just compare share of the international undergrad market by institutional type, and then compare that to share of the domestic market, and you'll see where some schools are really overperforming by type and where some schools are really underperforming. So in terms of share, in 2008, you can see again community colleges, perhaps more dominant than people imagine at that time, and then the larger doctoral and master's level institutions also quite prominent. By 2012, you can see that shift we saw on the last slide, with the most research-intensive schools gaining a lot of share and community colleges losing quite a lot of share. and all the others, in most cases, gaining slightly, but the smaller and medium master schools actually losing share, even though they grew overall, and the others not by much. And then if we pull up domestic market share, you can see the contrast. So this is 2008 and 2012. The share hasn't shifted much on the domestic side. But essentially the way to read this chart would be if the light blue bar, that ratio is higher than the orange line, then that means that category of institution is outperforming relative to its domestic share when it comes to international undergraduates. So certainly research, very high activity there on the far left, more than double its domestic share when it comes to international undergraduates. The next category, also above but not by so much, the doctoral other category, it's getting closer. The largest master's category, a slight outperformance when it comes to international undergrads, but only slight. And then master's medium, master's smaller, it's actually underperformance relative to domestic share. The liberal arts schools, it's a little bit higher. Standalone art and design colleges, much higher. So that's a very internationalized sector. And then community colleges, much, much lower. It was lower in 2008, and it's even more. It's even lower now in 2012. So all this to say, schools of all shapes and sizes across this spectrum are looking to expand their international recruitment, but some seem to be succeeding much more so than others. And the question is why? Is it because certain better-known brands on the far left were artificially constraining capacity in the past? The domestic market was strong. There was no particular need to recruit international numbers above and beyond the norm. That's now changed in certain respects, and that capacity has opened up. So has that simply shifted capacity to where the market wanted it in the first place, and that's what we're seeing? Or is it also a function of sheer visibility and brand recognition? Inevitably, there's only a few schools that are well known at the moment outside the States, and other schools may be having a hard time getting visibility, or may be assumed to be not necessarily worth the investment, or there's confusion about status or type or value for money. So I think the question for the kind of schools that we approached about this webinar is, to what extent can an institution, through a dedicated marketing campaign, investment in services, branding, and through a tool like the International Student Barometer, where you can get an objective read on your international student experience against others of all shapes and sizes, and then be able to take that intelligence to the market, as well as internally in terms of reform, investment, reorganization, and so forth. I think it's a mixture of both. There's definitely more capacity opening up, but there's also, I think, a lot of potential for the wide range and number of U.S. colleges and universities to take better advantage of burgeoning demand, greater awareness, greater choice, easier ability to reach different markets without necessarily having to spend huge sums around the world and forge relationships for the first time. So just before I turn to my colleagues, I just want to conclude this section with some sort of synthetic remarks. So the value of the ISB, I've been pointing to it as we've gone through, but to me, the International Student Barometer represents something of a solution to three core challenges facing U.S. international student divisions, particularly those trying to ramp up and really increase numbers, increase visibility. So the first challenge, I think, is that the reason so many schools are chasing international growth is because of weaknesses in the domestic market. We know enrollment has been going down overall, or creeping up only slowly in a few categories. State appropriations are still recovering from their peak. Endowments are often under pressure or unavailable. So international students, insofar as they pay full freight, are not eligible for domestic financial aid in many respects, are a very useful means of balancing the books. But the risk, obviously, is that schools over-enroll, or they insufficiently scrutinize who they enroll, and they end up with short-term gains and longer-term problems in terms of a vicious circle of poor feedback, frictions around the experience, faculty and others feeling insufficiently prepared or resourced to handle the change in population. So how can the ISB be helpful? The ISB is an external comparative perspective on what the institution does well when it comes to recruiting and serving international students, and also inevitable weaknesses and areas that need change, investment, reorganization. Having an external perspective on what's working well and what's working less well can be very helpful in advocating for change, influencing higher-ups, just trying to bring some perspective to this question rather than just advocating internally based on anecdote and personal experience very often, or just an internal survey. Second challenge, as I mentioned at the beginning, many perspectives, not much data. To reiterate, I would argue that US higher education international divisions activity is very well served in terms of professional networks, small-scale studies in the literature, lots of local on-the-ground intelligence and experience, but very little big-picture perspective, both within the US, let alone beyond the US. And I would argue that's increasingly important. Students face the benefit or the challenge of a lot of choice. There are a lot of other countries around the world chasing this market, and the benefit of the ISB is cross-institutional perspective, so not just your own institution, cross-country rather than only US, longitudinal rather than just a one-off survey, insights, as we'll see later, that you simply cannot get by other means other than through doing this kind of survey over time. And then the final challenge, I phrased it as the power of internationalization is hard to wield. Clearly there's more to international student enrollment than balancing the books. There's clearly a lot of benefits that are real and valuable, but at the same time, trying to effect them in short order in a highly complex and fast-changing environment can be very, very difficult, particularly in large decentralized institutions. So the ISB can be helpful here too. It represents a common measure of success, not the only measure, but a single consistent measure that can be applied over time. It can apply across the academic and service divide, and it can substitute for often multiple internal inconsistent surveys that are valuable in their own right, but often don't amount to the kind of cross-institutional as well as intra-institutional perspective that everybody ultimately wants. And it can be a way to move from a current conception of internationalization steadily in terms of increments, working towards something more nuanced and more sophisticated over time. So just before I turn to our panelists, this slide just gives you a sense of an example of range we see in the data. So this is focused on the recommendation question. Would you recommend this institution to a compatriot to come and study abroad? And it's a 5-point scale question from what we term active ambassadors, people who will go out of their way to say positive things about the institution, right down to the opposite, which is people who go out of their way to say negative things about the institution. This slide focuses on the combined proportion who say they're either in that active ambassador category or they're more passively positive, the dark green. And each line is a particular institution. So you can see in combination, the range is from over 90% would recommend in some sense down to about 65%. But if you look at that dark green, the active ambassador, the ideal category, those students who will aid future recruitment, who will represent positive referral and word of mouth, who will be active and generous alumni down the road, you can see a much wider range from around 50% in that category for the best performing institutions, right down to barely double digits on the other end. So the question that the ISB can begin to help address is, how do we explain this distribution? Why is it that some schools have an experience such that they achieve 50% or better, ideally, in that active ambassador category, that ideal category, whereas others struggle to achieve barely 10% in that group? and thinking about the huge difference that can make in terms of visibility, brand, marketing, conversion, efficiency, yield, all those essential metrics and activities. The ISB can give a single institution perspective on their performance that otherwise simply isn't available other than through conversation, conferences, and so forth. So let me now turn to our two panelists. I'm very pleased to welcome Katie Gilbertson, who is Director of International Student Services at Johnson & Wales University, a private entrepreneurial institution in Rhode Island and with campuses around the country. And then Jennifer Grunwald, who is Director of International Student and Scholar Services at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Obviously a public institution, part of a major public university system. Katie, let me start with you. Could you just give us a quick sense of, thinking back to when you first considered the International Student Barometer, some sense of the international student recruitment context at Johnson & Wales at that time, and where you thought the ISB might be helpful?
Sure. Thank you for having me. The ISB is, when we started looking at this, we were really trying to figure out where we were going in terms of the type of student we were getting and from what countries. We were looking at the agents. We use a lot of agents in our university, and we were looking at how do we use these agents and what are our students feeling about them. So looking at the ISB, it addressed those questions, and it seemed to be a way that we could get information from the students without directly asking them, as well as understanding our experience benchmarked against other people who have used agents. So that was one of the main reasons that we started to look at this. As the Director of International Student Services, I actually was not one of the people who started this, which was the Vice President of our admissions department. So, but they were really looking closely at how we attract students in recruiting. We have a smaller budget, and we needed to maximize our resources and wanting to know if the agents were working.
And thinking about the first time you got the data back from the ISB, how did you begin to think about acting on that data? There's obviously a mass of different directions you could go in. There's good news in the data, there's less good news in the data, and it's not a single simple process, it's an ongoing process. But give us a sense of how, as an institution or as in terms of your division, how you began to act and think about sifting through the findings to good effect.
Sure, that's a good question. We actually, because the admissions department and the International Student Services Department was very interested in all the data that the ISB gave us in terms of the 4 aspects of the living, learning, arrival, and support services. My department was more interested in the arrival and support services. Of course, we were also interested in learning, which our academic departments looked at as well. So one of the great things about the ISB for us was that we could look at the data holistically throughout the entire university. And as a Director of International Student Services, oftentimes the international students are the our responsibility, and sometimes the institution as a whole sees the International Student Services Department as responsible for these students. But what's clear with the ISB is that the whole institution is responsible for these students. So from my perspective, it was very helpful in gaining some resources for support. And so when we looked at the data, we chose to focus on the things that we did very well and continue to ramp up those services. So one thing that we did very well was arrival services. And so we made sure that we did the same things, if not enhance those services a little bit better. But to focus our efforts, we really wanted to focus on the things we weren't doing so well. And some of the things were in aspects such as home friends, host friends, and the integration of international students in our campus. So because we focused on those things, we could make small changes within our office to help integrate the students when they first arrived here, as well as developing programs to get students more involved with each other. And so basically we did that for the second year and then retested with the ISB for the second year and found some positive results and some things stayed the same. So we're using that information again to tweak our services, enhance our services. This year we're actually doing a complete overhaul of all of our orientation services.
Thank you. Jennifer, turning to you at Wisconsin-Milwaukee and building on Keiichi's comments, thinking back to the rationale for considering something like the ISB, what were some of the thinking at the time?
Sure. The main reason that we began the survey was thinking about different ways to market ourselves. We've been trying to ramp up our recruitment as much as we can. We've seen some growth at our institution in international student enrollment. And, you know, we all are out there and students say, well, how are you ranked? You know, they want to know how the university is ranked. And University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee has rankings in some of its schools and colleges that are very prestigious, but overall it doesn't have like the selling point that a lot of students are looking for. So we were thinking, how can we turn this around and talk about the student experience and say, you know, out of our students surveyed, 98% say this, or just ways to talk about how we rank compared to other schools participating in the survey, other schools in the U.S. and other schools overseas. So that the recruitment tool was really a big part of it. I think also to echo what Katie said, participating was initiated in our office, and a big challenge that all of us have is having the campus really feel ownership of international students, and to help the campus understand the roles and the international student, you know, of course the visa, all the visa activity that goes on, and of course the arrival and orientation is part of the international office. But our goal is to think of the students as UWM students first and international students second. And I think by sharing the results of the survey and really focusing on the learning environment, the housing, which is outside of our office, the libraries, the labs, all of those things really help us to get the whole campus on board. Another real benefit that was kind of just an unexpected outcome was the student affairs folks looking at this data and really commenting on how it tracked with other survey data that's been going on campus, and really looking at some themes overall, and that just helps us think about the student experience and the international experience specifically.
And give me an example of a result from the ISB that either was a big surprise, you had no idea that something was very well received or not. Is there an example like that?
Sure. Well, we have not had a lot of success with arrival with airport pickups. That's something that we've been trying for years to get some buy-in on campus. And when the campus realized that this could really make a difference, and we saw the first year, you know, students saying this is something they really needed, there was real collaboration in creating an airport pickup, and both in Chicago and in Milwaukee. Collaboration by working together, but also financially supporting it outside of our office, which is what we needed. And so that's a great outcome. Kind of an interesting surprise was how well our institution did on the survey just about classroom size. Students were, or class size. Students were so pleased at the size of our classes, we didn't realize that was a huge selling point, but they really found that that was an attractive quality that UWM had to offer, the ratio of students to faculty.
And Jennifer, you referenced the potential power of the data for future recruitment purposes. Some of our clients go so far as to actually publish the results of their ISB on an annual basis and regard that as a form of, I suppose, accountability on the one hand, but also promotion insofar as they do well on the survey. It's something they can use, as you said, if they're not particularly well ranked or well known, but otherwise do very well on our survey. And we do, there are ways that we, in terms of the feedback we give, allows an institution to say, you know, we were ranked X in the world or Y in the world on a particular item. How has your institution thought about that question of using nuggets of the data or even publishing the whole data? What's been the thinking so far?
You know, I really think we've done 2 years, and I believe we're going to wait until the 3rd year to think about how to move forward publicly with that. I think that we are very committed to continuing with this survey. It's been extremely helpful, and I think it's a real advantage to be compared across the globe. It's an advantage from a recruitment perspective to students to acknowledge that we know that students have a choice in where they go, and we need to compare it to the experience at other places. But also the advantage for just from a recruitment perspective on campus to help educate our colleagues, our leaders on campus, that this is an extremely competitive market, and we have to recognize what's going on, like in the UK, in Europe, in other places, in Australia, New Zealand, and realize that we can't just get by on the U.S. brand. We have to work really hard and see what's going on and how we're comparing to these other places.
Thank you. And Katie, going back to you, I think of Johnson & Wales as an institution that has expanded a lot in recent years, not least when it comes to international students. And someone in your role, Director of International Student Services, in a sense you're at the sharp end of that balancing act between taking advantage of demand in the marketplace, recruiting, and then having to really make it work on campus in terms of a compelling student experience. The ISB has sort of come into that environment at Johnson & Wales in recent years, but just speak to that, if I've characterized it correctly, that tension between pace of growth, taking advantage of demand, which may be beyond your office, and then your office having to sort of react and respond and make good to that ever larger international class.
It's definitely true. In the past few years, and I know this is not just something that's unique to Johnson & Wales, but the Chinese student growth here has been tremendous. We went from 27 Chinese students in 2008 to about 800 that we have now. And so one of the great things with the ISB is that I've been able to look at the data from the Chinese student perspective. I can break down the data to see what are they happy with and what aren't they happy with, which has been really helpful for us. Just trying to service them, because you're right, it is difficult. I'm not the person who brings the students in, but once they're here, they're mine. So, and then the institution has choices to make on how we service these students, and the feedback that we get from the ISB really lends itself to making correct choices and better choices for how we service these students. Our campus, Johnson & Wales, is unique in the fact that it has 4 full campuses in other parts of the country. So we have one in Denver, Charlotte, and North Miami, and I oversee the immigration policy for all 4 campuses. We also administer the ISB over all 4 campuses. So one of the things that's been nice is to see how our international students are doing on the other campuses. There's great big differences in the types of students that come to the different campuses as well as their needs. So we've been able to take the data and break it down by countries and regions and really tailor our services to those students based on which campus they're on.
Great. And on that note, that's a great segue actually into the final section of today's webinar, and that is to give you and the audience a sense of the kind of big picture insights that the data generates, precisely because we're dealing with tens of thousands of students, multiple institutions, multiple countries. We can start to contribute to this question of how many international students is somehow enough in a particular institution. Is a certain pace of growth perhaps excessive? Is perhaps a predominance from one country, typically China at the moment, problematic at a certain level, and problematic in what sense? We've just finished a report that we'd be happy to share with you if you're interested, that looks at some of these patterns and trends, but I wanted to just show you a few examples now. So what I'm going to show you is on some of the integration variables, so satisfaction among international students with integration with other kinds of students, what seems to affect that particular performance, and then on some aspects of academics, what seems to affect satisfaction there. So this slide, let me explain what you're seeing here. This is looking at 48 universities across US, UK, and Australia. Each dot or diamond represents one of those institutions. And then it's looking for patterns across two different variables. So on the vertical axis, which is overall satisfaction among international undergraduates from last fall, and then the horizontal axis is the proportion of undergraduates at each of those institutions that are international students. So essentially, is there a relationship between intensity of international enrollment and satisfaction? And you can see here that there's a modest negative relationship, about 0.11, but it's modest. So essentially, the more grouped those diamonds are to that line, the more that line explains variation. And the more scattered those dots are, then the less it explains variation. So here, a little more than 10% is explained by that variable alone. So that's good news. That means that you can enroll 5% international to 30, 40% international, and there'll be some friction that comes with that, but it's not overwhelming. Other variables determine overall satisfaction. So let's start to dive into what those might be. And there's always outliers, as you'll see, that either underperform relative to the trend or overperform. So again, the good news there being institutional action, strategy can make a big difference regardless of circumstances and the composition of the student body. If we look at graduate students, and here we're combining master's and doctoral, and here we're introducing the China variable. So this is looking at the first of the integration questions. So satisfaction on integration with host students, so meaning if they're at a US school, integration with Americans, or if they're at a UK school, integration with UK students. And then contrasting that level of satisfaction with the proportion of international grad students that hail from China. So you can see here a stronger negative relationship, nearly 0.3, so explaining around 30% of the variation that you see here, much stronger than we saw on the previous slide. And just to orient you on the scale we're using here, this is a 4-point scale question, so a score of 4 would mean every single student was very satisfied, and a score of 1 would mean every single student was very dissatisfied. So the higher the score, the higher the level of average satisfaction. So you can see a stronger trend line, a bit more bunching around that line, so a stronger relationship. So when we go from just international student intensity in general to dominance from one country, in this case China, which is typically the dominant source country for most institutions in this sample, you can see the relationship becomes more problematic. But again, there are outliers. Institutional action or lack of action can make a big difference. Now, this is one of the most striking relationships we've seen so far in ISB data, at least looking at 2013. This is going back to undergraduates, and it's comparing satisfaction with making friends with other international students, so not domestic students and not students from your own country, but other international students. And then keeping the focus on China, the proportion of undergrads from China. Here, this combination seems to explain nearly 60% of the variation. So essentially, the higher the intensity of undergrads from China, the lower the satisfaction with integration with other international students. And in some ways that's logical, but to see it across 3 different countries, 48 different universities, a very, very high correlation given the number of variables and diversity in this sample, I think is very, very powerful. So insofar as an institution is embarking on a China-centric recruitment strategy and wants to know what might happen to some key satisfaction metrics such as integration, that's why students come, not just for the academics, but to really be integrated in an international environment. Once that China ratio climbs 10%, 20%, 30%, and so on, it's a pretty clear and negative impact on that satisfaction average. Now, if we just look at a couple of academic items, the survey asks all kinds of things about academics, but in this case we're looking at, again, staying with undergraduates, average satisfaction with lectures. Lectures in all 3 countries, and particularly the US, is a mainstay of the undergraduate pedagogical experience. And I think for international students, it's a mixed blessing. It's perhaps comfortingly anonymous, it's not interactive, and if you don't have confidence in your language skills, or you're not used to you're used to a more didactic environment, then the lecture can be quite reassuring. But on the other hand, it's not a great way to work out whether international students are grasping the main point, are they taking adequate notes, are they checking their understanding. So what we look at here is satisfaction with lectures against a proportion of all undergrads that are international at these institutions. And you can see, not as strong as we saw on the last slide, but again around 1/3 of the variation seems to be explained by intensity of enrollment. And behind this you could tease out also pace of growth, perhaps limited preparation or training for faculty to handle a very different class composition than perhaps a few years ago. Some of this can be very concentrated in certain academic departments, engineering, business, for example, so it can be acute in certain parts of the institution, and that can color the results too. But essentially you can see a lot of schools bunching around that line, relatively few dramatic departures from the line. So in some sense, an institution can use this data to say, well, if we, other things being equal, if we don't increase training, raise awareness among faculty, perhaps try different pedagogical strategies in certain departments and courses and programs, then chances are we're going to see more and more friction here. But clearly, some schools are making the most of it, beginning to plan, beginning to offer more guidance, and that's showing up in terms of better satisfaction. Others are perhaps doing quite the opposite, are growing much faster than they are thinking about the consequences of that growth, and then that's starting to weigh down their overall satisfaction levels. And obviously, this is a macro quantitative perspective. We don't know exactly what's going on in every school, but to complement this data, we increasingly, we haven't done it yet in North America, but we will be doing it from next year, is to also convene good practice sessions to get more qualitative color on why a school performs the way it does. Why does it outperform? Why does it underperform above and beyond these high-level figures? And the last slide I want to show you on this theme is about interaction with faculty. So you might say, well, if lectures suffer from a more international student body, perhaps international students make up for it by resorting to faculty time outside class, and maybe faculty similarly complement lectures with more open office time, perhaps. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the case. We see a pretty similar relationship. So this is contrasting the proportion of undergrads that are international with satisfaction with time with faculty outside class. And you see again around 30% of the variation seems to be explained by intensity. So again, not all the variation, institutional action or lack of action can make a big difference, positive or negative, but there's definitely a force applied to numbers, ratios, composition, and pace of growth of the international student body, almost regardless of institutional action in most cases. So all that to say, the ISB permits that kind of analysis that simply isn't available, as far as I know, through any other means, and it can ground a particular institution's approach, assumptions, and allow it to chip away at moving from average or below average in certain areas to something that's more exceptional and something that can really start to build a brand around and make a concerted effort towards what are typically pretty ambitious growth objectives. This slide just highlights two reports, in fact, that we've put out this year. The first one, the Sleeping Giant report, is an analysis of the recent surge in international student enrollment in U.S. higher education, puts it in an international context, thinks about some of the implications, takes a critical look at some of the IIE data, some of the standard numbers, and offers some alternative perspectives on that. And then the most recent one that we've just put out is an initial analysis of student satisfaction data across those 48 institutions from UK, Australia, and the US, and going into a lot more detail, but the kind of analysis that you just saw there, but with a lot of supporting commentary and analysis. If you're interested in having a look at either of those, get in touch. Our contact details are on the final slide. Just before we finish, and I know we're almost out of time, but Katie or Jennifer, any reactions to those? I know I shared the report with you previously, and you may not have had a chance to read it yet, but what's your sense of going to that kind of analysis from iGraduate and the ISB, building on the kind of analysis you've seen previously?
Well, are you talking about just the last few slides that you've shown?
Yes.
I think that is really, really telling and a really important tool to share with the financially driven recruitment model people that want more international students just for the finances. I mean, those slides really demonstrate that the experience with more may not. What do I want to say? It's just not very hopeful.
Right. I think it's, as you say, it's helpful insofar as it shows the consequences of a sort of standard approach to growth. But I think it's also encouraging in that it shows outliers. It shows institutions that have managed to make it work at a certain level of intensity. It may be more experience, but it also, I'm sure, is strategy, policy, execution on the ground, consistency.
Absolutely.
I think you can I think take a number of things from those slides, but it's not necessarily saying stop recruiting. It's saying
no.
Think about it in the round, and great things can happen with a more nuanced approach.
Yes.
Okay, we are essentially out of time. I didn't see any questions come over the chat from the audience, which is fine. But if you do want to get in touch, pose a question to us, or we can pose questions to our panelists as well, if that would be helpful. Our contact details are there. Do reach out to us if you are interested in taking part in the ISB. If you'd like to receive one of the reports that we've put out, very happy to share those with you, talk in more detail about your needs and how we might be helpful. As it says at the bottom, we're a global company. We have our North America presence, but we also have presence in the countries that you see there. We're very much trying to be as international as international student recruitment is in and of itself, because I think that matches what everyone's trying to achieve and offers perspectives that really help. So thank you to Katie and Jennifer for taking the time to be on our panel. Thank you to those in the audience who joined us, and we look forward to further conversations. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Richard.